Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast, brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock, and I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So in this episode, I welcome Dr. Stephen DeLay back onto the show, and here we discuss his new translation of the late French philosopher Jean-Louis Chrétien's book, 10 Meditations for Catching and Losing One's Breath. Stephen is also an old member of Christ Church at the University of Oxford and the author of philosophical works and works of fiction, including Elijah Newman Died Today and Faint Not. So with that, let's head over to the interview. Thanks so much for listening, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. Well, I am here once again with Dr. Stephen DeLay. We're welcoming him back onto the show after a good long while. He came on previously to talk about Kierkegaard and French phenomenology, but today we're going to be talking about his new translation of Jean-Louis Chrétien's book, 10 Meditations for Catching and Losing One's Breath. So, Stephen, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's been a while since you've been on, and for anybody who's maybe not familiar with your work or hasn't listened to that prior episode, I'm wondering if you could just share a bit with our listeners about yourself and about your work too.
Thanks for having me on. So I do work in phenomenology, particularly work in the area of French phenomenology, which we'll be discussing today. And I'm also a novelist as well.
Awesome. I mean, you wrote the textbook on French phenomenology, at least like the theological turn, right? I mean, I know the answer to this already because I've read the book, but could you say a little bit about the book that you put together, that you wrote on, that's kind of an introduction to French phenomenology?
Yeah, it was sort of a fortuitous event. When I was completing my doctoral studies at Oxford, I went to a Routledge event that the publisher was putting on, seeking submissions from doctoral students. And I ended up meeting Tony Bruce, who manages the philosophy list over there in the United Kingdom. And I told him a little bit about my work. And he said, "Hey, well, we're looking for an introduction to French phenomenology. Would you like to do it?" And I said, "Well, sure, of course." And so I ended up writing a book called Phenomenology in France, a philosophical and theological introduction, which was published in 2018. And that covers a number of these phenomenological French figures, including Jean-Louis Chrétien.
Yeah, no, it was one of my entry points to French phenomenology, especially to the theological turn, and so it was extremely helpful and was just such a nice launching pad to actually go and start reading those thinkers themselves. So I'm very grateful for you writing that book. So as we get going here, kind of turning to Jean-Louis Chrétien, but also our opener question that we ask all our guests. So if you could place any three thinkers, dead or alive, together in a room, we'll say together with Jean-Louis Chrétien, since we're talking about him. But if you could place them, three thinkers in a room with him, and then listen in on their conversation, which other three thinkers would you choose and why?
Well, I suppose if one were to consider who Chrétien himself would like to have had the conversation with, that's one question. I don't know who he would have chosen. But for my own part, I think the three figures that I would be most interested to hear Jean-Louis have a conversation with would have been Augustine, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky. I think for reasons that will become clear as we talk more about Jean-Louis Chrétien's work, why I would select Augustine is pretty obvious. Augustine is an incredible influence on Chrétien's work. Chrétien was a deep admirer of Augustine. Many of the questions and themes that recur throughout Chrétien's work are borrowed from reflections that Augustine had in his own work. So I would be really interested to hear what Jean-Louis would want to ask Augustine. And then Kierkegaard also, of course, is an important figure for phenomenology. There's been a lot of work done recently where people are thinking more carefully about the way in which Kierkegaard, in a way, is a kind of proto-phenomenologist, and how he influenced not only thinkers like Heidegger, but also Husserl. And this Kierkegaardian influence in French phenomenology trickled into Jean-Louis Chrétien's work as well. Chrétien mentions Kierkegaard by name very often, and he's also alluded to indirectly throughout a number of Chrétien's works. And of course, Kierkegaard is considered a kind of existentialist, and there's existential aspects to Chrétien's own thinking, particularly his interest in interiority and selfhood, and also questions about Christian witness and just what it means to be a Christian philosopher, or what it means to do philosophy that is in a way responsive to Christ. Kierkegaard thought very carefully about this for his own part, and so does Chrétien. And there's ways in which Chrétien, I think, works out this task himself as a writer that's indebted to Kierkegaard's own way of having done so. And then Dostoevsky, I mentioned Dostoevsky because one of Chrétien's later works is a 2-volume work on the modern novel. And Chrétien was very interested in poetry and literature, and he draws extensively on a number of writers throughout all of his works, not just philosophers and theologians, but also poets and novelists. So I would be interested to hear Chrétien have a conversation with Dostoevsky, partly because Dostoevsky was deeply Russian and Chrétien was deeply French. And everyone who knows a little bit about Dostoevsky knows that Dostoevsky was very critical of Western Christianity and Catholicism and Europe. And so I would think it would be very interesting to see Dostoevsky and Chrétien have a discussion about Christian faith and the nature of the novel and the literary enterprise in light of their zeal and their Christian witness, and Chrétien's interest in the nature of literary truth and how that relates to theology and philosophy as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That'd be a very fun conversation to listen in on. Kind of turning to our first question, I think a lot of people have placed Chrétien alongside these sort of theological turn French phenomenologists, right? The new phenomenologists are sometimes called. Are there characteristics to Chrétien's work that you think distinguish him from other thinkers in this movement? So I know you're very familiar with the work of like Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, Emmanuel Faulk, many others. But in what ways is Chrétien's work maybe distinct from some of theirs?
Well, I can come to the question of the sense in which Chrétien is a new phenomenologist or a French phenomenologist, or an exponent of what's called the theological turn of French phenomenology. That's actually a topic I was able to discuss with him in person. And so I know firsthand how he felt about being classified, his work in that way. But with regard to what makes his work distinctive or different from some of these other figures whom he knew personally, were friends of his, and whose work was influential on his own, I think anyone who was to pick up a book of any of these thinkers, just within reading a few lines, would very easily be able to say, oh, this is a Marion. Oh, this is an Henri. This is a Lacoste. No, this is a Chrétien. They all have very strong, distinctive voices, very, very unique styles. And so that's what I think makes them all remarkable, is that they very much had their own way of approaching philosophical topics. That said, there's a lot of shared commonalities in terms of their focuses and the kind of questions that they're interested in. Although, as you say, there are differences as well. I think one thing that distinguishes Chrétien from these other figures to an extent is, even though he has a very distinctive and powerful voice that's present on the page, he's unique in that he's marshaling so many other thinkers at once to make the point that he wishes to make. And so when you read Chrétien, there's this deluge of poets and novelists and philosophers and theologians that he's quoting, and it's almost as a symphony, and he's a conductor. And of course, Jean-Luc Marion is incredibly well read. He's an incredible student of the history of philosophy, and his philosophical work is deeply historical. And so when you read someone like Marion, you'll be encountering so many thinkers as you meditate along with Marion. But Marion and Chrétien very much have different approaches. Marion can be very technical and rigorous in that regard. I do think that Chrétien is a very rigorous and careful thinker in his own way, but generally his texts tend to be, you could say, a little, stylistically speaking, a little bit more poetic and sort of informal and breezy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a long-standing debate that was occurring in French philosophical circles going back into the 80s and 90s over this issue of what's called the gift. And there was a famous debate between Marion and Derrida. Derrida was one of Marion's teachers at Villanova, where Marion and Derrida had a debate, Marion in a way representing the phenomenological position, Derrida representing the deconstructionist position. And the idea of the gift and its relationship to givenness is central to some of the works that have made Marion's work so influential, and works like Reduction and Givenness and Being Given. But Chrétien, for example, isn't very interested in that technical debate. He has a much more kind of commonsensical, colloquial idea of the gift, and it's not a technical focus of his. And the same thing goes with the question of what you could call subjectivity. So in post-Husserlian and post-Heideggerian French phenomenology, and this will be, I think, in a way, a segue to the question of what exactly the theological turn in French phenomenology is or isn't. One of the things that people like Marion and Henri have done is to try to call into question Heidegger's conception of the self, Dasein, and then also Husserl's conception of the transcendental ego. And in a way, this was a continuation of something that Emmanuel Levinas, who's an influence on Chrétien as well, had done in a work like Totality and Infinity. And so what's going on in a way is that Levinas and the French thinkers who come after him are questioning the limits of intentionality. And so broadly speaking, for Husserl and Heidegger, they're working within a broadly Kantian inheritance. So even though they're deeply anti-Kantian in important ways, you could say that they're Kantian in that they think that there are conditions for the possibility of what can be disclosed or what can be given or what can show up. And so in that sense, they are subjectivists of a certain kind, although they're not idealists in the sense of thinking that we create entities or something like that. They are, in that regard, realists. What happens is when Marion and some of these other figures call into question the transcendental enterprise, the idea that the bounds of givenness or the limits of what can be disclosed are in some sense determined by subjective conditions, this then in turn leads them to formulate a competing conception of what the self is. And so, for example, Marion in a work like Reduction and Givenness and Being Given abandons Husserl's idea of the transcendental ego, and then also Heidegger's idea of Dasein, and he has a new description of what he takes the self to be. And so does Michel Henry. In some of his later works, Michel Henry criticizes Heidegger's conception of Dasein as care. He also criticizes Husserl, and he coins this term of what he calls the transcendental illusion of the ego. Now, Chrétien, in my view, is very much in line with what Henri and Marion are doing. He's looking for a post-Husserlian, post-Heideggerian, and thus in that regard, post-Kantian conception of selfhood or subjectivity. And this goes to the heart of what Chrétien calls the call and the response, or what Marion has called in recent work the elsewhere, revelation. The idea that we come into our own and become who we are through a response to what is given, and that we ourselves don't dictate or determine the limits of what can be disclosed or what can be given. But there again, one thing that I think distinguishes Chrétien from someone like Marion is that Chrétien doesn't work out in a very formal, rigorous, explicit way what it is he means by subjectivity. He just sort of leaves it to the reader to kind of feel one's way around as you read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Do you think it's accurate or helpful to kind of group him within this theological turn, this movement, or to even just more generally kind of group these thinkers together as kind of theological turn phenomenologists or the new phenomenologists? Do you think that's a helpful or accurate category?
I do. Of course, there have to be qualifications and caveats, but I don't think that it's a misleading way of categorizing their thought at all. I think there certainly is something to it. And as I'll come to in a moment, Chrétien himself was happy to assume the label. Part of this has to do with, as I was mentioning a moment ago, with the history of French phenomenology and the reception of Husserl and Heidegger in France. So this is all territory that's very well known to people working in phenomenology, although it may not be that well known to people who aren't familiar with the phenomenological tradition. So just briefly to recount more or less how we come to Chrétien and why Chrétien is considered to be a proponent of the so-called theological turn. What happened is that, as many people know, Husserl and Heidegger were taken up into France through Levinas, who attended some lectures by Husserl, and then, of course, by Sartre in the 1930s with his work, The Transcendence of the Ego, and then later Being and Nothingness, and then later on in 1945 with Merleau-Ponty's publication of Phenomenology of Perception, and then also thinkers like Gabriel Marcel, who, although critical of Sartre and Heidegger, was still working more or less within a phenomenological milieu, and then, of course, someone like Simone Beauvoir. You have a subsequent generation that comes after them that's sort of mediated in a way through Paul Ricoeur into the 50s and 60s. And then you have in the late 70s, the publications of Marion's first two books, The Idol in the Distance and God Without Being, so that by the time we reach the 80s, when Chrétien published his first book, I think it was like in 1985, Marion is working at the time of what will become Reduction and Givenness. Of course, by this time, Michel Henry was well established, having published a number of books of his own. So there was already this milieu in Paris working in phenomenology, responding to Husserl and Heidegger, and then in turns that early uptake of those figures through Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. Now, there are people who have told me that they don't necessarily consider Chrétien to be a phenomenologist, or they don't consider all of his works to be phenomenological. The thinker that typically here is adduced as a potential counterexample to the idea that Chrétien is in fact a phenomenologist is the French philosopher Henri Maldini, who was a friend and intellectual mentor to Chrétien. And Maldini isn't really a phenomenologist. He belongs to a different kind of French philosophical tradition, going back to the French spiritualists. And so, for example, Jean-Yves Lacoste once told me that he didn't really consider Jean-Louis Chrétien to be a phenomenologist, but someone who was more working within that tradition of French spiritualism. And I know one time when I spoke to Claude Romano is a student of Chrétien's. He had questions about whether some of the later works of Chrétien were truly phenomenological as well. I happen to think that they are. When it comes to the question of the theological turn, we owe that turn of phrase from Dominique Janicot, who was a Heideggerian, a Husserlian. And in the 90s, he wrote a very critical essay criticizing Marion, Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas, Michel Henry, and Jean-Louis Chrétien. And according to Janicot, it's Emmanuel Levinas who initiates what Janicot calls the swerve of French phenomenology, the theological turn that, according to Janicot, occurs with the publication in the 60s of Levinas's Totality and Infinity. And of course, Jean-Luc Marion was deeply influenced, as I had said, by Derrida, but also by Levinas. So people will know about Marion's notion of the saturated phenomena. And one of the saturated phenomena that Marion formulates is directly taken from Levinas's notion of the face. So Janicot is critical of Marion's reduction in givenness. He's also critical of Michel Henry's phenomenology of life. He's less critical of Paul Ricoeur, but he's also very critical of Jean-Louis Chrétien. So when I had the chance to meet Jean-Louis Chrétien in 2018, I asked him how he felt about the phenomenology, the theological turn, and he actually laughed and he said, well, he saw it as, in a way, providential, because according to Chrétien, he said at the time that these guys were working in the 80s and the 90s, prior to Janicot having written his critical essay of their work, none of them had really seen themselves as working together under the umbrella of a movement. And this is actually something that, in a way, was confirmed by Lacoste. In 2019, I went to Paris for the IMPR conference there that year. And IMPR has members from all over the world, but there's certainly a lot of Americans. And so when Lacoste heard that I had come over for the conference, he was kind of laughing. He said, "Oh, all you Americans come over, and you think that we all sit around in cafes and seminars discussing our work." But he said, "It's not really like that." He says, "We have a conversation through our texts, and we read each other, but we actually have, fairly limited daily or weekly interactions with each other." And so I think what was going on is that Marion, Henri, Lacoste, Chrétien were intensive writers, and they were working through their own ideas on their own. And it just so happened that because of their own interests, it coalesced in this very organic way where outsiders could see, hey, there's something going on here. There's something afoot, even though it wasn't deliberate or self-conscious on the part of those who ended up being grouped in that way. But yeah, according to Chrétien himself, he didn't mind the label of the theological turn at all. And he actually thought that Janicot had, in a way, done them all a great favor, because it was by criticizing their work in the way that he did that Janicot's criticism of their work brought attention to the work that these guys were doing outside the French context.
Yeah, it backfired on Janicot. That's funny. Yeah, looking to your translation of this Chrétien book, 10 Meditations for Catching and Losing One's Breath. So in that book, yeah, as the title implies, it's kind of these brief meditations on these 10 different words. So words like breath, way, peace, wound, right? There are 10 of these that are all serve as kind of titles for each chapter. I'm wondering what's the significance of these words for Chrétien? Like, why do you think he chose to kind of orient his book around particular words? And what do you think he kind of might have been up to or trying to do by using this approach of focusing on words?
This is a question that is addressed carefully and at length in the foreword to the text by Emmanuel Housset. Emmanuel Housset was a student of Chrétien's, a friend of his, and he's someone who's published a number of really important works of his own, although unfortunately they haven't been translated yet, including a really fantastic text he wrote a few years ago on Husserl and the idea of God. But in any case, what he says in his foreword is that Chrétien has a very, I would say, phenomenological conception of language. And so, again, it's important to, I think, appreciate the state of affairs in France, the latter half of the 20th century, in which Chrétien was first working. People will know that there were a number of philosophical movements that dominated the French philosophical context. So, of course, there was structuralism and post-structuralism and deconstruction, and then, of course, phenomenology. And Marion and Henri make the claim throughout their life's work that phenomenology is philosophy. Michel Henry says in a number of his texts that the history of French philosophy is phenomenology, that phenomenology is philosophy. So Marion and Henri don't think that the phenomenological movement is a historical museum piece. They see it as a living philosophy. They see it as the continuation of philosophy. And they don't see it as just a subdiscipline of philosophy. They see it as being philosophy as such. And part of the reason they think this is that they thought that phenomenology was doing the genuine philosophical work that some of these other philosophical movements at the time that were dominating Paris, like structuralism and post-structuralism, were failures. And part of it has to do with competing viewpoints about the nature of language. And so the relationship between language and thought, and the relationship between language and truth, and competing notions of the relationship between language and experience. And part of this has to do with the way of competing ways of taking up Heidegger. So, for example, there's a American commentator, Christina Lafont, who has claimed that Heidegger was what's called a linguistic idealist. And the idea is that experience is shaped and structured by our concepts and by our words, such that we don't actually have any access to the things themselves, as it were, but really we're, in a way, stuck in our language. And this is a view that you find more or less in the other philosophical movements in France, with the exception of phenomenology. Part of it also has to do with other literary critics and thinkers, like, for example, Maurice Blanchot. So in a work like The Art of Speech, Chrétien actually criticizes this sort of broadly Hegelian conception of language, where language, or the concept, is thought to be an act of negation, that it somehow murders or destroys what it names, right? And so Uset in his foreword talks about this idea of the linguistic turn that one also finds in 20th century analytic philosophy. And Chrétien is very much opposed to all of this. He's not a linguistic idealist. He's not someone who would ascribe to the analytic philosophy's linguistic turn. He's someone who thinks that, and this is hence the title, The Arc of Speech, that human speech expresses the nature of things, that it gathers things together, that it amplifies them, that it works with their voice, that it doesn't negate things or distort things or elide things, but it's actually something that is already responsive to the things themselves. And this is why he has this idea of the call and the response. So the idea for Chrétien is that our language, our words, are responsive to a claim or a call that things are already issuing forth, that in a way, the things themselves, they speak to us. So Chrétien is very much interested in subverting any sort of hard and fast dichotomy between the world and our language, between experience and language. He thinks that it's all intermingled, all interblended, that although we think and speak in words, that we're not relegated just to the linguistic, but that rather that the world itself is infused with logos, with language.
It's extremely helpful. You mentioned Emmanuel, who sets forward a couple times there. He does say in that forward, he says that in this book, Chrétien kind of develops. This is his words. He says a hermeneutic of finitude that underscores the agonic dimension of wholly exposed, naked existence. And he also says, again in his words, our fragile, fleeting existence can be offered up. So this is according to Chrétien, and it is in this gift that a dimension of eternity lies. And I know other thinkers have thought about Chrétien as this kind of thinker of existential precarity. So someone like Christina Geschwantner, I know, has written about him in that way. I'm wondering, from your perspective, in what ways do you think Chrétien is kind of a philosopher of like exposure or of existential nudity or precarity? And then also, I guess kind of a similar question. What form does this take in his philosophy?
Yeah, that takes us back in a way, I think, to a question you had just asked previously, which is what is the difference, if anything, between what Chrétien is doing and some of these other French phenomenological figures? And I had mentioned the idea of thinking subjectivity beyond this post-Kantian inheritance, so beyond the idea of a transcendental ego or a Dasein. And so the precarity or the vulnerability that Chrétien is interested in identifying has to do with this idea of exposure or the call, that we're always already responding to an elsewhere, as Marion would say, to a revelation, to the nature of things in the world, in a way that we don't have mastery over it, right? Mm-hmm. And so for Chrétien, philosophy and writing is a response to what's already called us or claimed us. And there's a distinction that Chrétien makes himself in his final work that was published during his life called Fragility, where he distinguishes what he calls vulnerability from fragility. And he says the two are often confounded. So in a really nice essay by Timothy Troutner around the time Chrétien passed away, Troutner mentions that according to Chrétien, fragility in a way is the fundamental figure of human finitude, because unlike vulnerability, which is a matter of exteriority or something coming from without us, from the external world, Fragility is something about the inherent nature of the human experience itself. And so what makes Chrétien interesting is that he is very much a thinker of human finitude, of the limits of human being, of our weakness. And yet at the same time, it's precisely that vulnerability or that fragility, that weakness, the fact that we are subject to something beyond ourselves, that in a way allows him to think infinity, or to think God, to think revelation, that man is somehow placed within a circumstances that renders him always responsive to something that transcends himself.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to focus in on one of his chapters. He devotes to he's got this meditation on the word attention. How would you describe kind of Chrétien's thinking of this word in that chapter, kind of throughout this book, but also just elsewhere, kind of in his broader body of writings?
Well, in this chapter in particular, as in all the other chapters, he mentions so many other figures who have something to say about the phenomenon that is drawing his attention. And so in the chapter, he mentions Freud, but the figure that I think that emerges as key, and the figure who's closest to identifying what Chrétien wants us to notice, is Simone Weil. And Chrétien's view, in my reading, is that attention is an action. It's something that we do, and so it's a bit paradoxical because, on the one hand, Chrétien wants to emphasize that we are not self-sufficient, that we aren't autonomous, that we're always already beholden to something that exceeds us, that we're always responding, and yet at the same time, that response depends on us being responsive, doing something. And so attention is crucial, I think, for Chrétien's conception of the human being and the human condition, because it's something that involves a kind of surrender or a kind of dereliction, a sort of letting go, so that one is responsive to what is making a claim on us. And yet at the same time, it requires that we do this. We have to choose to be responsive in that way. And if we don't choose to be responsive in that way, then what would otherwise have manifested itself or shown itself or revealed itself can't. And so attention in Chrétien's view is, I would say, a matter of love. And so you might think things that we care about or love, those are the things that we pay attention to. The things that we don't care about, the things we don't love, those are the things we ignore, that we don't give attention. So for Chrétien, ultimately, I would say attention is an expression or a manifestation or a form of love, of a kind of loving response to what is attempting to issue a claim on us.
So, I mean, is what he's doing with kind of attention and contemplation, is it similar in any way to like the late Heidegger is doing with kind of this turn towards like a contemplative phenomenology, where we see like Heidegger almost doing this kind of Zen Buddhist phenomenology in his later work? I mean, are there similarities there? Are there differences? What do you think?
There are certainly similarities, although ultimately there are radical differences. So an important similarity is that this goes back to the idea of the call, right? That, like, anyone who's read Being in Time and Heidegger's other writings knows that Heidegger talks about the call. For example, in Division 2 of Being in Time, he talks about the call of conscience. And for Heidegger, in light of what he calls the ontological difference, that is to say, the difference between entities and beings on the one hand, or being, he thinks that philosophy, which he calls metaphysics, the tradition of Western philosophy from Plato, culminating arguably in someone like Hegel, has failed to think being. It's not responsive to the call of being. It only focuses on entities, right? So for Heidegger, philosophy is ontological because it's inquiry into being, not beings. And so for Heidegger, we have to pay attention to being. And he thinks that the philosophical tradition, by and large, has failed to do that. So in that respect, Chrétien is following in Heidegger's footsteps, in that he thinks that there has to be this response to a call. But of course, the difference here is that, unlike for Heidegger, who in a way is a methodological atheist, he has very little to say about God. For Chrétien, ultimately, the most primal, immemorial claim on man, the one who issues the first and most important call on us, is God. And so, in a work like The Arc of Speech, Chrétien examines what he calls the call of beauty, and he basically asks, sort of in this tradition of natural theology, going back to Romans 1, whether the beauty of creation does or doesn't actually point us to a call of a creator that's being issued through his created beings. So the similarity here with Heidegger is that Chrétien is thinking human subjectivity in terms of the call and response structure. The important difference, of course, is that unlike for Heidegger, for whom the call is being issued by being, for Chrétien, ultimately it's God who's issuing the call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, Chrétien seems unique a bit in that his philosophy, it presents kind of both a vision for contemplation as well as a vision for, like, we could call it fraternity or responsibility, or even maybe we could say ethics. So how does he kind of balance those two? Because I think a lot, so many philosophers tend to either see these as like oppositional, or they tend to kind of move more heavily in one direction or the other. So like someone like Levinas tends to not be a big fan of contemplation, but instead leans heavily towards ethics. Whereas Chrétien seems to hold these in balance in some way. So yeah, how would you describe kind of how he pulls that off, or how he does that?
This is a complicated question because, of course, everyone knows, going back to the Greeks with someone like Aristotle and others, there's a notion of philosophy as you say, being contemplative. It's being a matter of theory, not practice. And this is a criticism of philosophy, particularly in the 19th century, from thinkers like Marx, and then into the 20th century with some of the more politically minded structuralists and post-structuralists who are very interested in praxis.
Mhm.
Chrétien, it's true, is in a way a contemplative. He thinks that philosophy is meditative, right? Hence the term for the book, 10 Meditations for Catching and Losing One's Breath. There's a chapter in the book that I chose to translate as recollection, although it could have been translated as meditation or contemplation. And part of what's going on here is that people who know the history of Christian spirituality will know that in the Middle Ages and the medieval ages, you had spiritual exercises, you had meditative practices, and a lot of these Christian theologians had very complicated and ornate distinctions among what they would call consideration, meditation, and then indeed contemplation. So, for example, someone like Thomas Aquinas thought that, properly speaking, the only thing that man can contemplate is God, and that we don't contemplate, strictly speaking, anything else but him. There
Mhm.
were other people, like, for example, Richard de St. Victor, who thought that anything can be a matter of contemplation. So what happens is that terminologically, there's argument about what contemplation is, what the object of contemplation is, what the goal of contemplation is, and then how, in turn, contemplative practice relates to a more broad active life. Chrétien, I think, in a way, is subverting these kinds of distinctions, because I think he thinks that our meditating on things, contemplating things, this turn to what might have been considered theory, is in a way practical. And I think one way in which that comes into focus is here again, if we think about someone like Levinas, right?
Mhm.
So Levinas has, as people will know, this idea that it's in the encounter of the face of the other that we are called to responsibility for the other. So in that regard, the phenomenal disclosure of obligation, the experience of feeling claimed by another, taken hostage by another, the experience of feeling obligated to do justice to the other, is in that way a very practical affair.
Mhm.
At the same time, if we consider what Chrétien has to say about attention, part of the point is that others won't make that kind of claim on us, or we won't respond properly to that claim unless we're properly attentive to it.
Hmm.
And that kind of attention that's essential to the intersubjective ethical dimension of human experience with regard to others is a kind of attention that Chrétien is broadening to encompass the kind of meditative contemplative practice that may typically have been associated with just pure theory and rather than practice.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. What about Chrétien's account of gentleness? Because you've got this, his eighth meditation, right, is devoted to gentleness. He also uses, well, you translate also words he uses as sweetness or softness in that same meditation in that same chapter. So, how would you describe his account of gentleness?
I think maybe the word, if we were to settle on just one English word, although that's not the word that I used, I chose to entitle the chapter for reasons I explained, it may be meekness. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and again, this goes back to the idea of revelation coming from elsewhere, the idea that there has to be a kind of relinquishment or abandonment or a surrendering of oneself to the claim of the things around us. And so it goes again to the idea of the call and the response structure. If I'm hardened to what's around me, if I'm prideful, if I'm stubborn, if I'm trying to be self sufficient, then what Chrétien thinks is that there's going to be things that fail to show up to me or don't show up in the right way. So, this is where he brings in this language of suppleness or flexibility, this idea of being open to things, being vulnerable. You had mentioned earlier nudity or nakedness, exposure,
Mm-hmm.
this idea that
Mm-hmm.
we shouldn't be closed off to what's around us, but rather in suppling up and being flexible and being available and being soft, as it were. Um, we find ourselves encountered by something that would otherwise not have made itself manifest. So Chrétien thinks that there is a kind of suffering or a kind of wound that comes with allowing oneself to be claimed by these things. That's why the later chapter, the final chapter of the work is called Wound. The idea is that part of what it is to respond to what's claimed us, whether it's another person or a situation, is feeling the sting of admonishment if we're failing to be properly responsive or properly attentive, feeling the wound, the burden of the ethical injunction, right? These are the kind of things that Chrétien thinks is essential to our humanity, but they're experiences that we can choose not to have. We can be closed off to them. And so the idea of being of softness or gentleness or sweetness is Chrétien's way of trying to get at this idea that as a matter of disclosure, as a matter of givenness, as a matter of receptivity and availability, being soft and being sweet is a way in which we can be opened up rather than closed off to these kinds of experiences and encounters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's well said. Thank you. Okay, final question. I wanna, speak to this kind of relationship between almost mysticism and philosophy in Chrétien's work, because obviously he's like you said, he's a very rigorous philosopher, very attuned with the history of philosophy and with kinda contemporary French philosophy, but his writings, like you said, they're kinda breezy reading, but even more so, I think they often feel like a almost this kind of blend of philosophy and this kind of like mysticism. He almost comes off as like a mystic in a lot of his portions of his writing, and a poet as well too. Do you see him as kind of a mystic in a way? Like, is it possible? Do you think to be a philosopher and a mystic in one and the same text?
Yeah, great question. I want to come to the issue of what Chrétien himself was like as a person, because most of us have only encountered him through his texts, and that's how I first encountered him. And I think that part of what makes Chrétien's work so unique and what made him unique as a man is that uh, he's very present on the page. Even though he is humble and very self-effacing, he has such a strong voice that when you read him, you're struck and you wonder, who is this person who's writing these things? It's just
Yeah,
so extraordinary, right? And
yeah.
so, first of all, to answer your question, my view is that yes, he is a mystic, But what I have to say is that in the original manuscript, I was gonna in the description for the author, I said he was a mystic, but his executors, Jerome Laurent and Camille Ricoeur, told me not to say that.
Hmm.
And so I don't know if that's because they themselves don't consider Chrétien to have been a mystic, or whether they think that he is, but they know that Chrétien would not have wanted to be called one. And part of the problem here is that scholars in this area know that what we mean by mysticism is itself such a complicated and contested question.
Yeah.
So to go back to the tradition of Christian spirituality in the medieval ages that we've sort of been alluding to earlier, Chrétien, he wasn't a spiritual practitioner in that regard. He was a bachelor. He was a philosophy professor, and he has a reputation. He actually mentioned it. He says, "Oh, there's this huge legend around me," and he started laughing because people who read his work who've never met him, they hear stories that, well, he was a recluse or he was a hermit or something, but he wasn't at all. I mean, he was a professor of philosophy. He had many, many students, many, many friends.
Yeah.
A kind of, I think, illustrative example of this is one of Chrétien's other translators, John Dunaway, who did a translation of Under the Gaze of the Bible, tells the story in his translator's introduction to that work about how he just showed up in Paris and went to Chrétien's office, introduced himself, and said, "Can I translate this book?" And Chrétien said, "Sure." So Chrétien was deeply approachable, very personable, very easy to get along with. So it's true that he was private. He didn't have email. His phone number was private. So if you were living outside of France, it could be difficult to reach him. But that wasn't because he was a recluse or a hermit by any stretch of the imagination. But with the question of mysticism, I would say he is a mystic in that he is so incredibly sensitive and so attentive to all these different subtle features of the human experience that you would think, well, if his powers of description and his powers of attunement to all that can conceivably disclose itself to us in everyday life, if that doesn't count as a form of mysticism, then what would? I remember when I was reading, I think it was Hand to Hand, listening to the work of art, a work that was translated a number of years ago by Stephen Lewis. There's a passage in which Chrétien is describing like the water droplets on a window frame. And I remember being struck by just the exquisiteness of the description and just being blown away by this man who would be so captivated by something that most of us would just never even notice, much less think to write about, much less write about in a way that discloses something that's so fundamental and so essential to our condition as what water droplets on a pane look like. So
Mhm.
my view is we can consider Chrétien a kind of mystic in a certain regard, insofar as a phenomenologist, as someone who is doing what he can to bring to our attention the nature of the world and the kind of experience to which we're capable. If we're receptive to it, then he certainly qualifies as a mystic in that regard.
Sure, sure. Well, I always like to close our episodes by giving our guests a chance to share any works they have in progress or anything they'd like to plug. So, is there anything you're working on, or anything you'd like to share about as far as your work? And then also, where can our listeners find you and learn more about you and your work?
Well, as it happens, a friend of mine, Alan Porter, is currently editing a volume on posthumanism and phenomenology, and I'll be contributing a chapter to that volume. And it's a chapter that's going to be drawing on Chrétien, a work of his called Philosophical Recognitions, a chapter in that text called Happiness and Temporality. And the title of the chapter is going to be A Note on the Glory of Being Human, according to Kierkegaard and Chrétien. So I'm working on that at the moment. That will hopefully be out next year. And then I'm also working on a number of books right now. I think the main book that I'm hoping to complete next is a book called The Imitation of Christ in Film Noir. And
Nice.
then as for how people might learn more about my work, my books, they're available on publisher sites and, of course, Amazon. So if they just look me up online, they'll be able to find my books.
Sure. Well, thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure learning from you about Jean-Louis Chrétien, and I really enjoyed this book. As you know, obviously we've talked a good bit about it, outside the podcast, but I think you've pulled off a really beautiful translation. It's a short, for our listeners, it's a short book. It's only 105 pages. And like Stephen said, breezy but really beautiful reading. So I'd highly recommend it. The book is called 10 Meditations for Catching and Losing One's Breath by Jean-Louis Chrétien. Stephen, thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.